Hi, welcome back to IndyCar on the 9th of February. Now, normally in this programme I report news and I analyse things that are happening in the political arena, but rarely do I involve myself in what some people would call, I suppose, political philosophy. But what I'm going to do with the programme today is to compare the two very apparently different political systems of the West and the Russian Federation, because there are some distinct similarities between the two systems, and I think it would help in the understanding of the Scottish public in their role, their situation in the larger political structures which exist in the UK. Now, what am I talking about? Well, those of you who watch the news feeds might actually know that in Russia, a challenger to Vladimir Putin has emerged in the form of a man called Boris Nadezhdin. Now, Boris Nadezhdin is a professional opposition politician from, I suppose, traditional Russian politics. He's worked in various levels of what purports to be Russian local democracy and bureaucracy. Anyway, the reason I mention him is there are distinct similarities between Mr. Nadezhdin and Alex Salmond, and I'll explain what I mean in a moment. Now, for the larger picture, if you imagine the two systems of our domestic democracy here in the UK, or what we think of as our democracy, and I think shall we say, the play acting of democracy which exists in the Russian Federation, we can see there are some similarities, but let me explain what I mean by similarities. In the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin exists basically as an authoritarian dictator. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, we've got that sort of thing here already in the form of the Conservative Party, which has a very tiny vote share and yet maintains power against the wishes of most of Scots, which is true. In Russia, something similar is happening, but on a broader scale. The reason the Kremlin decided to let Mr. Nadezhdin stand against Vladimir Putin was twofold. Basically, they tried to create what I would call a playpen, or a theatre, in which this challenger to Vladimir Putin can perform. In other words, he can say what he likes, he can oppose Putin, he can oppose the war, and the Kremlin is basically giving him the time and the space to do that within certain boundaries, and those boundaries are clearly understood by Mr. Nadezhdin. He knows what he's allowed to do. And at the end of this kind of song and dance routine, where he puts up his opposition to Vladimir Putin, opposes the war, says pretty much what he wants, he then has to go back, I suppose, to the Kremlin to negotiate again, to say, well, I've done my bit. But what was the point of that? The point of that was that the Kremlin wants to demonstrate, both to its domestic audience in Russia, that there is at least the illusion of some kind of democracy, that there is some kind of opposition, and that people who share Mr. Nadezhdin's opinions feel some sense of agency. There is somebody to rally around who is saying the kinds of things which they believe, and it gives them the opportunity, even to a limited extent, to have things like demonstrations and to wave placards and to go to his political rallies. However, this playpen I've described is clearly very similar to the situation that Scotland finds itself in. We have a system called devolution, which was created as our playpen, which allows our politicians in Holyrood to give us the impression that there is some democracy. We do have some agency, we have some choices, but they're limited to our local level. So in this respect, I would say Mr. Nadezhdin is the Russian equivalent of either Nicola Sturgeon or Humza Yousaf. He is the person who is allowed to have an opposing voice in a much larger entity, in our case the United Kingdom. But that's clearly limited to simply 50 MPs at Westminster and a limited power assembly in Holyrood, which has the powers over domestic affairs but nothing else. So Nicola Sturgeon, and laterally now I would say Humza Yousaf, are playing the role that Mr. Nadezhdin does in Russia. In other words, they're the voice of opposition to the UK and to Scotland remaining in it. So we're not complaining so much about a war that the UK is engaged in, at least not yet, but we are complaining about the fact that we have no democracy here and that we have no control over our country, and we are basically opposing that. But in opposing that, there are strict limitations to what Mr. Yusuf, and before him, obviously, we had Nicola Sturgeon. Now, I mentioned in my previous programs that when Nicola Sturgeon went to the Supreme Court, it was a red flag. It was basically the United Kingdom saying to Ms. Sturgeon at the time, you are pushing the boundaries of this playpen and we're not going to let you cross them. And to remind you of this, you now need to go to the Supreme Court, which will then say that your referendum that you've been promising is illegal, and you will then have the opportunity to retire in a normal way and step back from politics. Now, the role of Humza Yousaf, as I've said, is to replace Nicola Sturgeon, to continue that same messaging in that same playpen. Allows Ms. Sturgeon a relatively dignified exit and perhaps a retirement plan involving writing her memoirs or whatever, right? But she's out of the way. But that now casts, I think, Mr. Salmond in the role of Alexei Navalny, the man who really led the opposition in Russia and who is now in prison. He's been marginalized and he's out of the picture. And the Kremlin hoped that Mr. Nadezhdin would split the opposition vote against Putin. In that respect, it backfired. In our situation, when Mr. Salmond was sidelined by the trumped-up charges in the Kangaroo Court case, it did split the opposition into ALBA, which Mr. Salmond now leads, and the SNP, which was the original idea of sidelining Salmond in the first place. Only in the case of the United Kingdom system, it worked. And it fractured the independent support into two parties, three if you count the Greens, although most people discount them. So there are distinct similarities here between the two systems. Both of these systems, the United Kingdom's pseudo-democracy, I think is the kindest way of describing it, and Vladimir Putin's illusion of agency that he gives the Russian people, that there is some sort of opposition that they can support, is very similar. And both systems, both the Russian authoritarian system and the United Kingdom authoritarian systems, depend on each other because each of them needs to have an external enemy which helps to support and cement in place the very conservative, with a small c, authoritarian regimes which rule each country or each region or each federation, each empire, whichever you want to call it. And they do the same things for the same reasons. The United Kingdom system is not so extreme. There isn't the violence, there aren't the gulags and the imprisonment of people that we see in Russia, at least not yet, although it is heading in that direction. So from the point of view of Scottish independence, we too have been infantilized and confined to effectively a playpen. You'll notice that the quality of Scottish MSPs is not as high as you would expect. I think it's fair to say that there are a handful of Scottish MSPs who are of good quality, who end up in government positions sometimes, who end up as ministers of the Scottish Parliament, or in high offices, if you like, leaders of the SNP group, say in Westminster, or ALBA in Westminster. However, it leaves us in the same situation. Scottish politics is infantilized and mocked by the United Kingdom. We're made to feel small, like we're not important, we don't have any power, and basically the Holyrood Parliament is a pretended parliament for us to play in, while the big boys and girls, the actual grown-ups down in London, do the actual running of the country. So in that respect, the two systems are mirrors of each other. And I think until we recognise the fact that we, as Scots, are living in a playpen, and that the playground outside is the international community, we cannot free ourselves from that playpen because the bigger kids down in London will not let us out. And so everybody who exists as an MSP or as a Scottish politician supporting independence is limited by the barriers around them, and they can't remove them because the United Kingdom basically holds all the cards, and possession is 9/10 of the law, and they have taken possession of virtually all of our natural resources and are basically sticking the two fingers up to us and saying, you can't stop us because we're bigger than you. So how do we get out of this? Well, recognising the fact that our system, although it is a little bit milder than that in Russia, are similar to one another. There's similar techniques being used. to create the illusion of agency, so we feel like we have some kind of choice, is reflected in things like the next UK general election, where we'll be given a choice of the SNP or the Union, and that is it. And the SNP will win, and the SNP will win a lot of seats, and it will get a majority. But it will get a majority inside the playpen of restrictions placed around it by the UK. The maximum number of MPs now possible for Scotland is only 57. They've reduced it by 2 to the advantage of the Tory party. When it comes to the ruling political elite in the United Kingdom, it is a revolving door tag team of the Conservatives and the Conservative Labour Party. And this is why Sir Keir Starmer has ended up as leader of the Labour Party, because the Conservative political establishment in London likes him. He's not going to scare the horses, he's not going to do anything socialist, and therefore the political establishment in the UK is secure in its rather precarious current position. And that is what conservatism in the United Kingdom is. It's a mirror reflection of the conservatism of the authoritarian regime which exists in the Russian Federation, and it balances it. The two of them threatening each other with nuclear weapons is part of the balancing act. It keeps both political systems cemented in place, and it does not allow small countries like Scotland to escape the playpen. And that's why for the last few weeks I've been banging the drum for stepping outside of the playpen into the larger playground of the international political arena. And that is where we will find the support that we need to end the union, because there is no other way out. We are basically infants standing inside a playpen with a great big padlock on it. We cannot get out of it unless the big children outside allow us to do so. And that means none of our politicians can really escape, and none of them will be able to come up with the combination to this padlock, because to do so would mean they'll be referred back to the Supreme Court and told they can't. And that would be the end of that. So we circle back to where we were before, in the playpen. So we have, as people now, not to support our politicians, except perhaps in the general election. I'm not saying don't vote for the SNP. In fact, I'm saying vote for the SNP. We still need them. We still need a competent government in Edinburgh for when we do become independent. And that's very, very important. But at the same time, we need to throw our weight behind Salvo. We need to throw our weight behind the Edinburgh Declaration. The Declaration of Allegiance to Scotland is political freedom. It's freedom to exercise its right to self-determination in the international field. And to do that requires the people to get behind it, because that's the only place that we will get real political agency and real democracy strong enough to break the shackles of this playpen that we find ourselves in. And that is using my extremely elastic analogy of the playpen and the larger playground to its fullest extent. But that perfectly describes the political system that we're trapped in. And when I say trapped in, I mean permanently trapped in, unless we basically piggyback ourselves over the fence, if you like, over the playpen and out into the larger playground to talk to some of the other big kids in the other areas around this huge playground of Europe in which we should be a member. So that's it from IndyCar today. I hope you found the metaphors and analogies I've used a little entertaining, but I think it's the only way you can really look at this. And it's kind of scary to think that the United Kingdom has got parallels with an absolutely horrible regime in Russia. It's just doing so with softer gloves. That's it from IndyCar today for this week. I will see you again, I hope again on Sunday, maybe with some news this time. But I think it's important to understand our place, and I say the word place in the way that it's used in the United Kingdom. We have to know our place in the great hegemony of Tory conservatism and Labour, all combined into one great big political establishment in London, which has got the keys to the padlock of our playpen. I'll see you all soon. Bye for now.